Sometimes the most innocent among us carry the heaviest burdens, and sometimes it takes the courage of one good man to make sure those burdens don't crush a child's spirit forever. Sheriff Cole Harding thought he'd seen everything in his 23 years keeping peace in Willow Creek. Then 8-year-old Clara Mae walked through his door at dawn, her torn blue dress telling a story no child should ever live. She'd been at a sleepover at the powerful Lanton Ranch the night before. Now she stood trembling in his office, barely able to speak about what she'd witnessed. The Lantons owned half the town and had friends in high places, but when Cole saw that frightened little girl, none of that mattered. He walked to his telegraph and began tapping out a message that would risk everything he'd built. What had happened at that ranch that would make an old lawman throw away his career to protect? One small child. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Willow Creek, Arizona Territory, painting the weathered storefronts in shades of gold and amber. Sheriff Cole Harding had watched this same sunrise for 23 years, each dawn bringing its own troubles and triumphs to the frontier town he'd sworn to protect. At 57, his weathered hands bore the scars of countless encounters with desperate men and dangerous situations, but his steel-gray eyes still held the steady resolve that had earned him the respect of honest folks and the wariness of those who walked crooked paths. The sheriff's badge pinned to his vest had lost much of its original luster over the years, its tin surface worn smooth by countless brushes against door frames, saddle leather, and the occasional fistfight. But to Cole, that badge represented something far more valuable than the few cents of metal it contained. It was a covenant with the people of Willow Creek, a promise that someone would stand between the innocent and those who would do them harm. Cole's office occupied the ground floor of a sturdy adobe building on Main Street, its thick walls keeping the interior cool even during the scorching summer months. The wooden desk that dominated the small space had been crafted by Hans Müller, the town's German carpenter, from oak that had traveled all the way from Missouri. Behind it hung a faded daguerreotype of President Lincoln, a reminder of the principles that had guided Cole through the war and continued to shape his approach to law enforcement. Deputy Tom Brennan, barely 25 and still eager to prove himself, sat at a smaller desk near the window, methodically cleaning his Colt revolver with the attention to detail Cole had drilled into him. Tom had arrived in Willow Creek 3 years earlier, fresh-faced and full of idealistic notions about justice and heroism. Cole had taken him under his wing, teaching him that real law enforcement was less about dramatic shootouts and more about understanding people, knowing when to show mercy and never backing down when innocence was at stake. Morning's been quiet. So far, Tom observed, glancing up from his weapon maintenance. Mrs. Henderson stopped by earlier to report that someone's been stealing eggs from her henhouse again. Cole nodded, filing away the information. In a town like Willow Creek, even small crimes mattered. A person who would steal eggs might graduate to bigger things if left unchecked. And maintaining order meant paying attention to every detail, no matter how trivial it might seem. The Lanton Ranch sprawled across 15,000 acres of prime grazing land just north of town, its boundaries encompassing some of the finest water rights in the territory. Samuel Lanton had arrived in Willow Creek 20 years earlier with a substantial fortune, political connections reaching back to Washington, and an immediate understanding of how power worked in frontier communities. Within 5 years, he'd purchased not just the ranch, but significant interests in the bank, the general store, and the territorial stage line that connected Willow Creek to the outside world. The Lanton family lived in a sprawling adobe mansion that would have been impressive in Santa Fe or Tucson, let alone a small frontier town. Samuel's wife, Margaret, came from old Philadelphia money and never let anyone forget her refined Eastern breeding. Their daughter, Elizabeth, now 16, had been educated at an exclusive boarding school in San Francisco. while their two sons were attending university back east, being groomed to expand the family's influence even further. Samuel Lanton sat on the town council, contributed generously to the territorial governor's political campaigns, and maintained correspondence with senators and congressmen who valued his insights into territorial affairs. When disputes arose, and in a frontier community they always did, people often found themselves choosing between fighting Samuel Lanton or finding a way to accommodate his interests. Most chose accommodation. Cole had always maintained a professional but distant relationship with the Lantons. He recognized their importance to the community's economic stability, but something about Samuel's easy confidence and Margaret's dismissive attitude toward the common townspeople had never sat well with him. Still, in 23 years, he'd never had cause to investigate anything more serious than a boundary dispute involving Lanton property, and even that had been resolved quietly through negotiation. Clara Mae Sullivan was 8 years old, with auburn curls that caught the sunlight and green eyes that sparkled with intelligence and curiosity. Her father Patrick worked as a blacksmith, his strong hands shaping iron into horseshoes, tools, and the countless metal implements that kept a frontier community functioning. Her mother Mary took in sewing and laundry, supplementing the family income while caring for Clara Mae and her younger brother Timothy. The Sullivan family lived in a modest but well-maintained house on the eastern edge of town, close enough to hear the church bells on Sunday morning, but far enough from the saloons to avoid the noise when the cowboys came to town on payday. Patrick Sullivan had served briefly in the Union Army during the war, though he rarely spoke of his experiences. Like many men of his generation, he believed that some memories were best left undisturbed. Clara Mae attended the town's one-room schoolhouse, where Miss Catherine Porter taught reading, writing, arithmetic, and geography to children ranging in age from 6 to 14. The girl showed promise in her studies, particularly in reading, and Miss Porter had mentioned to Mary Sullivan that with proper encouragement, Clara Mae might even be able to attend the territorial normal school someday and become a teacher herself. The friendship between Clara Mae and Elizabeth Lanton had developed naturally despite the vast difference in their family's social standing. Both girls were intelligent and curious, and both sometimes felt isolated. Clara Mae because her family's modest circumstances set her apart from the wealthier children, and Elizabeth because her parents' prominence created barriers to ordinary friendships. When Elizabeth had invited Clara Mae for a sleepover at the ranch, both mothers had agreed it would be good for the girls. The telegraph office occupied a corner of the general store, its brass key and clicking sounds representing Willow Creek's connection to the broader world. Messages traveled along the wires to Tucson, then on to territorial headquarters and beyond. For Cole, the telegraph represented both opportunity and responsibility, a way to call for help when local resources proved insufficient, but also a means by which territorial authorities could second-guess his decisions and override his judgment. Walt Kramer operated the telegraph with the precise attention to detail that his former career as a railroad telegrapher had demanded. He understood the importance of accuracy in transmission and the equally vital importance of discretion. In a small community, the telegraph operator often knew sensitive information before anyone else, and Walt had learned to keep his own counsel about most of what passed through his hands. The territorial capital in Prescott seemed impossibly distant from Willow Creek, but the political influence that flowed from that administrative center affected every aspect of life in the smaller communities. Territorial Marshal James Crawford had built his reputation during the Apache campaigns, and his network of deputy marshals and local sheriffs formed the backbone of law enforcement across Arizona Territory. Cole had served under Crawford during two particularly difficult investigations involving cattle rustling and claim jumping, and he'd come to respect the marshal's judgment and integrity. But territorial politics could be complicated. Powerful families like the Lantons had connections that reached into the territorial administration, and Cole had seen other sheriffs find their careers ended when they ran afoul of influential men with political connections. The key was to build unassailable cases, to document everything carefully, and to ensure that any action taken could withstand scrutiny from higher authorities who might have their own reasons for preferring certain outcomes. As the sun climbed higher and the town began to stir with its usual morning activities, Cole reviewed the previous day's reports and planned his rounds. Tom would handle the routine patrol while Cole made his weekly visit to check on the schoolhouse, the church, and the families living on the outskirts of town. It was steady, predictable work, the kind that allowed a man to sleep well at night, knowing he'd done his duty. Neither Cole nor Tom could have anticipated that their morning would be shattered by the arrival of a frightened child whose torn dress and terrified eyes would challenge everything they thought they knew about their community and the powerful people who shaped its destiny. The badge on Cole's chest had weathered many storms over the years, but it was about to face its greatest test. The first thing Cole noticed when Clara Mae pushed through his office door was the blood, dried and dark against the faded blue fabric of her Sunday dress. The second thing he noticed was how her small hands shook as she clutched a crumpled handkerchief, stained with the same rusty color that streaked her dress. But it was her eyes that made Cole's heart clench with immediate understanding. In 23 years of law enforcement, he'd seen that particular look of terror and violation before, always in the faces of victims who'd witnessed things no human being should endure. Clara Mae? Cole rose slowly from behind his desk, keeping his voice gentle and his movements deliberate. "What's happened, child?" The girl tried to speak, but only a strangled whisper emerged. Deputy Tom started to rise from his chair, but Cole held up a hand, signaling him to remain seated. Too many adults crowding around would only frighten her more. Instead, Cole came around his desk and knelt down so that his eyes were level with hers, the way he'd learned to do with frightened witnesses over the years. "You're safe now," he said softly. "Whatever happened, you're safe here with us." Clara Mae's green eyes darted toward the door, as if she expected someone to burst through at any moment. When she spoke, her voice was barely audible, the words tumbling out in broken fragments between ragged breaths. "Elizabeth, she didn't come back to the house. I waited and waited, but she never came back." Cole felt a chill run down his spine. "Come back from where, Clara Mae? Can you tell me what happened last night?" The child's grip tightened on the blood-stained handkerchief. "We were supposed to sleep in Elizabeth's room, but she said she wanted to show me something special, something her papa kept in the barn that she wasn't supposed to know about." Cole glanced at Tom, who had gone completely still, his weapon cleaning forgotten. Both men understood they were hearing the beginning of something that would change everything. "What kind of special thing?" Cole asked, though part of him dreaded the answer. "Men," Clara Mae whispered. "There were men there, in the barn, bad men who hurt people. Elizabeth said her papa made them go away sometimes, but they always came back. She said she wanted to see what they did." The words hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Cole had investigated enough crimes to recognize the pattern that was emerging, and every instinct he'd developed over 2 decades warned him that Clara Mae had stumbled into something far worse than childhood curiosity. "These men, Clara Mae, did they see you and Elizabeth?" The girl nodded, tears finally spilling over and streaming down her dirt-stained cheeks. "Elizabeth ran first. She told me to run the other way, back to the house. But I got lost in the dark and hid behind the water trough until morning. I kept waiting for her to come find me, but she never did." Cole reached out slowly and placed a gentle hand on Clara Mae's shoulder. "The blood on your dress, child. Is it yours? Are you hurt?" "I don't think so," Clara Mae said, looking down at herself as if seeing the stains for the first time. I think it might be Elizabeth's. When she ran, one of the men caught her. I heard her scream. The admission hit Cole like a physical blow. In all his years of law enforcement, he'd never had to investigate the disappearance of a child from one of the town's most prominent families. But more than that, Clara Mae's fragmented account suggested they were dealing with something that went beyond a simple crime. This sounded like a pattern of violence that had been hidden behind the Lanton family's power and influence. Tom finally spoke, his young voice tight with controlled emotion. "Sheriff, we need to ride out to the ranch immediately." Cole nodded grimly, but he also understood they needed to proceed carefully. Accusations against the Lanton family would require ironclad evidence, and any mistakes in handling the investigation could result in justice being denied, or worse, in more innocent people being hurt. "Clara Mae," Cole said, "I need you to tell me exactly what you saw in that barn. I know it's frightening, but it might help us find Elizabeth." The child's account came out in halting, terrified whispers. She described men she didn't recognize, voices she'd never heard before, and activities that made Cole's jaw clench with suppressed rage. Most damning of all, she'd overheard enough conversation to understand that Samuel Lanton wasn't just aware of what was happening, he was actively facilitating it. "Mr. Lanton was there too," Clara Mae said. "He was talking to the men about bringing more girls, about how nobody would believe children if they talked." Cole felt something cold settle in his chest. If Clara Mae's account was accurate, they weren't dealing with a single incident, but with an ongoing criminal enterprise that had been operating under the protection of one of the territory's most influential families. "Tom," Cole said quietly, "I want you to take Clara Mae to Doc Morrison's office. Have him examine her and document everything, every bruise, every scratch, every stain on her dress. Tell him this is an official investigation and we need proper medical evidence." "What about the ranch?" Tom asked. "I'll handle that myself," Cole replied. "But first I need to send a telegram." As Tom gently guided Clara Mae toward the door, the girl turned back to Cole with desperate urgency in her young voice. "Sheriff Harding, you have to find Elizabeth. Those men, they're going to hurt her if someone doesn't stop them." Cole knelt down again and looked directly into Clara Mae's eyes. "I give you my word, child. We're going to find Elizabeth and we're going to make sure the people who hurt her answer for what they've done." After they left, Cole walked to his gun cabinet and checked his Winchester rifle, ensuring it was properly loaded. Then he moved to the telegraph key in the corner of his office, his weathered fingers trembling slightly as he began composing the most important message of his career. The telegram he sent to Territorial Marshal James Crawford was brief, but carefully worded. "Urgent investigation required, Lanton Ranch. Child witness reports violent crime involving territorial officials. Request immediate confidential support. Evidence suggests ongoing criminal enterprise. Advise caution regarding local authorities. Cole Harding, Sheriff, Willow Creek." As the clicks of the telegraph key echoed through his office, Cole understood that he had just crossed a line from which there would be no retreat. The Lanton family's influence reached deep into the territorial government, and by sending that message, he had essentially declared war against some of the most powerful people in Arizona territory. But when he thought of Clara Mae's terrified eyes and blood-stained dress, when he imagined what might be happening to Elizabeth Lanton at that very moment, Cole knew he had made the only choice his conscience would allow. The badge on his chest had become more than a symbol of authority. It had become a weight of moral responsibility that he would carry, regardless of the personal cost. The morning sun continued to climb over Willow Creek, casting the same golden light across the same dusty streets, but Sheriff Cole Harding understood that everything had changed. The simple frontier town he'd protected for over 2 decades had revealed a darkness that would test everything he believed about justice, courage, and the price of doing what was right when powerful people preferred that the truth remain buried. The ride to the Lanton Ranch took Cole through familiar country, but the landscape seemed different now. Shadows appeared more menacing, and every copse of trees might hide evidence of crimes he was only beginning to understand. His horse, A steady sorrel gelding named Buck sensed his rider's tension and maintained a ground-covering lope despite the rising heat of the late morning sun. Cole had been to the ranch many times over the years for routine matters, property, disputes, reports of cattle rustling, and the occasional social call during territorial officials' visits. But today, he approached with the methodical caution of a lawman gathering evidence in what might become the most significant investigation of his career. The telegraph key back in his office represented his lifeline to higher authorities, but he understood that any help from Territorial Marshal Crawford was still days away. The Lanton Mansion sat on a slight rise overlooking the ranch's main buildings, its adobe walls and red tile roof designed to impress visitors with the family's wealth and sophistication. Cole had always found it somewhat out of place in the stark landscape of southern Arizona, like a piece of Spanish colonial grandeur that had been transplanted from some distant city and set down among the mesquite and palo verde. As he approached the main house, Cole noticed several horses tied at the hitching post that he didn't recognize, expensive animals with silver-trimmed tack that suggested their owners had money and position. His lawman's instincts kicked in, automatically cataloging details that might prove important later. A bay mare with distinctive white markings, a black gelding that showed signs of hard travel, and a paint horse bearing a brand he didn't immediately recognize. Samuel Lanton emerged from the house before Cole could dismount, his tall frame moving with the confident stride of a man accustomed to being in control of every situation. At 55, Lanton retained the bearing of the cavalry officer he'd been during the war, and his steel-gray hair was still thick and perfectly groomed despite the early hour. "Sheriff Harding," Lanton said, his voice carrying just enough warmth to be polite without suggesting genuine pleasure at the visit. "This is an unexpected pleasure. What brings you out to our humble ranch this morning?" Cole dismounted slowly, using the time to study Lanton's face for any signs of guilt or nervousness. But the man's expression remained perfectly composed, revealing nothing beyond mild curiosity about the sheriff's visit. "I'm afraid it's not entirely a social call, Mr. Lanton," Cole replied, keeping his own voice neutral and professional. "There's been an incident involving one of the children who was visiting your daughter last night. I need to speak with Elizabeth and get her account of what happened." For just a moment, so briefly that Cole might have imagined it, something flickered behind Samuel Lanton's eyes, but the expression vanished so quickly that Cole couldn't be certain what he'd seen. "An incident?" Lanton asked. "I'm afraid I don't understand, Sheriff. The girls had a perfectly pleasant evening. Elizabeth is still sleeping. You know how young ladies are about their beauty rest." "I'm sure she is," Cole said carefully, "but I'll need to speak with her nonetheless. The other child, Clara Mae Sullivan, arrived at my office this morning in considerable distress. She claims something happened here last night that I need to investigate." The change in Samuel Lanton's demeanor was subtle but unmistakable. His shoulders squared slightly, and his voice took on the tone of a man accustomed to having his word accepted without question. "Sheriff Harding, I think there may be some misunderstanding here. The Sullivan girl has always struck me as somewhat imaginative. Children that age often confuse dreams with reality, especially after staying in unfamiliar surroundings." Cole felt his jaw tighten. In his experience, adults who immediately sought to discredit a child's testimony usually had reasons for wanting that testimony to be ignored. But he kept his voice steady and professional. "Perhaps so, Mr. Lanton. That's exactly why I need to speak with Elizabeth, to clear up any confusion and make sure I have an accurate account of the evening's events." "Of course," Lanton replied, though his tone suggested anything but agreement. "However, I'm afraid that won't be possible this morning. Elizabeth isn't feeling well. A touch of something she picked up, perhaps. Mrs. Lanton is tending to her, and our physician has advised complete rest." The lie was smoothly delivered, but Cole had heard enough lies over the years to recognize the telltale signs: the slight pause before responding, the unnecessary elaboration, and the way Lanton's eyes looked past Cole rather than meeting his. Gaze directly. "I see," Cole said. "Well, perhaps I could speak with Mrs. Lanton then. She might have observed something that could help clarify the situation." "I'm afraid Mrs. Lanton is equally indisposed," Samuel replied. "You know how mothers worry when their children are unwell. Perhaps you could return in a few days when everyone is feeling more themselves." Cole understood that he was being dismissed, and under normal circumstances he might have accepted the delay rather than press the issue with such an influential family. But Clara Mae's terrified face and blood-stained dress had burned themselves into his memory, and every instinct told him that Elizabeth Lanton was in immediate danger. "Mr. Lanton," Cole said, "I appreciate your family's need for privacy, but I have a child witness who claims to have seen something that requires immediate investigation. As sheriff, I have a legal obligation to follow up on such reports, regardless of who might be inconvenienced." The pleasantries vanished from Samuel Lanton's expression, replaced by the cold authority of a man who was used to having his wishes respected by lesser mortals. "Sheriff Harding, I think you may be overstepping your authority here. This ranch is private property, and my family has rights that don't simply disappear because some disturbed child has spun a wild tale. Perhaps it would be better if you discussed this matter with the territorial authorities before proceeding further." The threat was implicit but clear. Samuel Lanton had connections that could end Cole's career if he pushed too hard. But as Cole thought about Clara Mae's desperate plea to find Elizabeth, he realized that his career meant nothing compared to a child's safety. "Mr. Lanton," Cole said quietly, "I've already been in touch with the territorial authorities. They're very interested in this matter. Now, I can conduct this investigation with your cooperation, or I can conduct it without your cooperation. But I am going to conduct it." The silence that followed stretched between them like a taut rope. Cole could hear voices from inside the house, male voices that didn't belong to the Lanton family. Those must be the owners of the unfamiliar horses, and Cole filed away the information for future reference. Finally, Samuel Lanton stepped back from the confrontation, but his eyes held a promise of future consequences. "Very well, Sheriff, but I think you'll find that my daughter has nothing to add to whatever fantasy the Sullivan girl has concocted. Children see shadows and imagine monsters, especially when they're away from home." As Cole remounted Buck and turned toward town, he understood that the real investigation was just beginning. The telegraph key in his office had become more than a tool for communication. It was his connection to the outside authorities who might help him protect Clara Mae and find Elizabeth before it was too late. Dr. Morrison's office occupied the second floor above Henderson's Mercantile, its windows facing west toward the mountains that ringed Willow Creek like ancient sentinels. The physician had served the community for 15 years, setting bones, delivering babies, and tending to the countless ailments that afflicted frontier families. But when Tom Brennan had brought Clara Mae to him that morning, the doctor's weathered face had taken on the grim expression he reserved for the worst cases. Cole found them in the small examination room, Clara Mae perched on the edge of the medical table while Dr. Morrison completed his careful documentation. The child still clutched the family photograph her mother had given her years earlier, a formal portrait taken during happier times that now seemed to represent an innocence that could never be fully restored. "Sheriff," Dr. Morrison said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of difficult discoveries, "I've completed my examination. The physical evidence is consistent with the child's account of what she witnessed." Cole felt his stomach tighten. "Meaning she shows signs of recent trauma, nothing that suggests direct physical assault, mind you, but the kind of psychological shock that comes from witnessing extreme violence. Her pulse is still elevated. She's experiencing tremors in her hands, and she's described nightmares that began immediately after the incident." Tom looked up from where he'd been gently talking with Clara Mae. She also gave me more details about what she overheard, Sheriff. Names, descriptions of the men involved, and specific conversations that suggest this wasn't an isolated incident. Cole knelt down beside Clara Mae, his voice gentle despite the urgency he felt. "Can you tell me about these other times, child? What made you think this had happened before?" Clara Mae's grip tightened on her family photograph, drawing strength from the smiling faces of her parents and baby brother. "Elizabeth told me her papa had special friends who came to visit sometimes. She said they played games that weren't really games, and that her mama always got sick when they came. She said if we were very quiet, we could watch from the barn." "Loft? What kind of games?" Cole asked, though he dreaded the answer. "Bad games," Clara Mae whispered. "Games that made people cry and beg them to stop. Elizabeth said her papa told her it was just business, like selling cattle or buying supplies. But she knew it was wrong because it made her mama drink the medicine. That made her sleep all day." Dr. Morrison caught Cole's eye and nodded grimly. The physician had been treating Margaret Lanton for what he'd diagnosed as nervous exhaustion. But now he understood that her condition might have a far more sinister explanation. "Sheriff," Dr. Morrison said, "I think we need to consider the possibility that Elizabeth Lanton may not be the only victim here. If Clara Mae's account is accurate, we're dealing with something that's been going on for quite some time." Cole rose and walked to the window, looking out at the peaceful main street of Willow Creek while his mind grappled with the implications. In 23 years of law enforcement, he'd investigated murders, robberies, and every form of violence. The frontier could produce, but this suggested something more organized, more deliberate, and protected by wealth and political connections that could destroy anyone who tried to expose it. "Tom," Cole said, "I want you to take Clara Mae home, to her family. Stay with them and make sure they understand the situation. Tell Patrick Sullivan that his daughter may be in danger because of what she witnessed, and that they need to be prepared for people who might try to intimidate them into changing her story." "What about you, Sheriff?" Tom asked. "I'm going to pay some visits around town. If this has been going on as long as Clara Mae suggests, there might be other families who've had similar experiences but were afraid to report them." Dr. Morrison cleared his throat. "Sheriff, you should know that I've treated several children over the past few years for injuries that I found suspicious. At the time, the parents insisted they were accidents, and I had no reason to doubt them. But in light of what we've learned today, I think those cases deserve another look." Cole felt a chill run down his spine. "How many children are we talking about, Doc?" "At least 6 that I can recall immediately. All from families of modest circumstances, all with injuries that could have been explained by accidents, but also suggested other possibilities. And in each case, the family seemed unusually reluctant to discuss how the injuries occurred. The pattern was becoming clearer, and Cole realized they might be dealing with something far worse than he'd initially imagined. If the Lanton family had been using their position to prey on the community's most vulnerable children, then Clara Mae and Elizabeth might represent only the tip of a much larger tragedy. Cole walked back to where Clara Mae sat on the examination table. "Child, I need you to think carefully about something. Did Elizabeth ever mention other children who came to the ranch for visits? Other friends who might have seen the same things you saw?" Clara Mae nodded slowly. "She said there used to be more children who came to play, but most of them stopped coming. Their families moved away or said they were too busy. Elizabeth was lonely because nobody wanted to be her friend anymore." The implication hit Cole like a physical blow. How many families had discovered what was happening at the Lanton Ranch and chosen to leave rather than confront such powerful people? How many children had suffered in silence because their parents feared the consequences of speaking out against one of the territory's most influential families? "Tom," Cole said, "when you take Clara Mae home, I want you to ask her parents about Families who've left Willow Creek in the past few years. Get names, dates, and destinations if possible. We might need to contact some of these people as witnesses." As they prepared to leave Dr. Morrison's office, Clara Mae tugged on Cole's sleeve. "Sheriff Harding, what about Elizabeth? Are you going to find her today?" Cole knelt down one more time and looked into the child's trusting eyes. "I'm going to do everything in my power to find her, Clara Mae. But I need you to be brave a little longer, and I need your parents to keep you safe while I work on this." "Will the bad men come looking for me?" she asked. Cole felt his jaw clench. "Not if I can help it, child. Not if I can help it." As they walked down the stairs from Dr. Morrison's office, Cole understood that he was facing the most complex and dangerous investigation of his career. The family photograph Clara Mae carried represented not just her own innocence, but the innocence of every child in Willow Creek who deserved protection from predators who hid behind wealth and social standing. The afternoon sun beat down on Main Street, but Cole felt as if a shadow had fallen across everything he'd thought he knew about his community. Somewhere out there, Elizabeth Lanton was either dead or suffering unimaginable trauma, and the people responsible were counting on their power and influence to keep the truth buried forever. Dr. Morrison's medical journal lay open on his desk, the careful handwriting documenting a pattern of injuries that painted a horrifying picture of systematic abuse hidden beneath the veneer of Willow Creek's respectable society. Each entry represented a child who had suffered in silence, their pain dismissed as accidents or childhood mishaps by adults who either couldn't recognize the signs or chose not to see them. Cole studied the pages with growing revulsion and determination. The entries dated back nearly 4 years, beginning with the Hendricks boy who'd supposedly fallen from his horse and suffered internal injuries that required weeks of recovery. Then came little Sarah Whitman, whose broken ribs were attributed to a tumble down the schoolhouse steps, though Dr. Morrison's private notes questioned how such a fall could produce that particular pattern of fractures. "Sheriff," Dr. Morrison said quietly, "I've been a physician for over 20 years, and I've learned to recognize the difference between accidental injuries and intentional harm. At the time, I documented my suspicions in my private notes, but I had no proof and no support from the families involved." Cole nodded grimly. "What changed your mind about keeping quiet?" "Clara Mae," the doctor replied. "When I saw that child this morning, the terror in her eyes, the way she flinched when I moved too quickly, I recognized the same signs I'd seen in those other children, the same fear, the same trauma that goes beyond physical pain." The office door rattled under a sharp knock, and Mayor Jonathan Pierce entered without waiting for permission. A portly man with thinning hair and the perpetually anxious expression of someone trying to please everyone simultaneously, Pierce had held his position for 3 years through careful attention to the wishes of the town's most influential residents. "Sheriff Harding," Pierce said, slightly out of breath from climbing the stairs, "I need to speak with you immediately about this unfortunate situation involving the Lanton family." Cole closed Dr. Morrison's journal and fixed the mayor with a steady stare. "What situation would that be, Mayor Pierce?" "You know perfectly well what situation," Pierce replied, his voice taking on the petulant tone he used when he felt his authority was being challenged. "Samuel Lanton contacted me about your visit to his ranch this morning. He's extremely concerned about the wild accusations being made by the Sullivan child." "Those aren't accusations, Mayor," Cole said evenly. "They're witness statements in an ongoing criminal investigation." Pierce's face flushed red above his white collar. "Criminal investigation. Sheriff, I think you may be letting your imagination run away with you. The Lanton family has been a pillar of this community for 20 years. Samuel sits on the town council, contributes generously to civic improvements, and maintains important connections throughout the territory." Dr. Morrison stepped forward, his weathered face set in determined lines. "Mayor Pierce, I've examined the Sullivan child, and her account is supported by physical evidence. We're not dealing with childhood fantasies here. Dr. Morrison, with all due respect, you're not a law enforcement officer, Pierce snapped. And Sheriff Harding, you seem to have forgotten that your position serves at the pleasure of the town council, a council on which Samuel Lanton has considerable influence. The threat was clear, but Cole had faced political pressure before. What concerned him more was the speed with which the mayor had responded to Lanton's concerns. It suggested a level of coordination that might extend beyond simple civic loyalty. Mayor Pierce, Cole said carefully, are you instructing me to halt a criminal investigation based on the political influence of the potential suspects? I'm instructing you to use good judgment, Pierce replied. Wild accusations against respected families can tear a community apart. Think about what's best for Willow Creek as a whole. Cole felt his patience wearing thin. What's best for Willow Creek is ensuring that children are safe from predators, regardless of how much money or influence those predators might have. The mayor's expression hardened. Sheriff, I'm going to be very clear with you. The town council will be meeting this evening to discuss your handling of this matter. I strongly suggest you reconsider your approach before that meeting takes place. After Pierce left, Dr. Morrison shook his head sadly. 23 years you've served this town, Cole. 23 years of putting your life on the line for people who are now ready to throw you aside to protect their own comfort. Cole walked to the window and looked out at the street below, where ordinary citizens went about their daily business, unaware that their community's foundations were being shaken by revelations of systematic abuse. Doc, I've been thinking about something Clara Mae said, about other families who left town after their children visited the Lanton Ranch. The Hendricks family, Dr. Morrison said immediately. They left 6 months after their boy's injuries. Said they were moving back east for better opportunities, but they seemed desperate to get away from here. Anyone else? The Whitmans left last spring, right after little Sarah's incident, and the Prescotts moved to Tucson after their daughter started having nightmares and refusing to leave the house. Cole felt pieces of the puzzle beginning to form a clearer picture. Doc, I need you to write down everything you can remember about those families, dates, injuries, anything they might have said that seemed unusual at the time. You think they might be willing to come forward as witnesses? I think they might. Be willing to help us save other children from what their own kids went through, Cole replied. But first I need to find out exactly what happened to Elizabeth Lanton. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Main Street as Cole made his way to the Sullivan house. He found Patrick Sullivan working in his forge, the rhythmic ringing of hammer on anvil providing a steady counterpoint to the blacksmith's obvious anxiety about his daughter's situation. Sheriff, Patrick said, setting down his hammer and wiping sweat from his brow. Tom told us what Clara Mae saw out at that ranch. Mary's been sick with worry all day, wondering if we should pack up and leave town before someone decides our girl knows too much. Cole understood the impulse. In the blacksmith's position, he might be considering the same option. Patrick, I won't lie to you. There might be people who want to silence Clara Mae or discredit her testimony. But running away won't solve anything. And it certainly won't help other children who might be in danger. What are you asking of us, Sheriff? I'm asking you to trust me to do my job, Cole replied. I'm asking you to keep Clara Mae safe while I build a case that will stand up in territorial court. And I'm asking you to help me contact some of the other families who might have gone through similar experiences. Patrick Sullivan studied Cole's face for a long moment, reading the determination and genuine concern he saw there. Mary and I have been talking about the families who left town over the past few years. Seems like there's been more than usual, and most of them left sudden-like without much explanation. Can you give me names? Patrick nodded. I can do better than that. I kept in touch with Bill Hendricks. He's working as a blacksmith in Denver. Now, if you want to contact him, I can give you his address. As Cole walked back toward his office, he felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. The medical journal Dr. Morrison had shown him proved that Clara Mae's experience wasn't isolated, but it also revealed the scope of what they were fighting against. The Lanton family hadn't just committed crimes, they'd created a system that preyed on the community's most vulnerable children while using their wealth and influence to ensure silence. The telegraph key in his office represented his only connection to authorities who might have the power to challenge such systematic corruption. But Cole also understood that sending messages to territorial headquarters carried its own risks. If Samuel Lanton's political connections were as extensive as they seemed, even territorial officials might choose political expedience over justice for abused children. As evening approached, Cole prepared for what he knew would be the most difficult town council meeting of his career. The medical journal would provide some evidence, but he needed more than Dr. Morrison's suspicions to convince a council that included Samuel Lanton's allies. What he needed was Elizabeth Lanton herself, alive, safe, and willing to corroborate Clara Mae's account. But with each passing hour, the chances of finding Elizabeth unharmed grew smaller, and Cole understood that time was running out for both. His investigation and his career. The badge on his chest had never felt heavier, but it had also never represented a more important cause than protecting the innocent children of Willow Creek from predators who hid behind respectability and power. The locked diary Tom discovered hidden beneath Elizabeth Lanton's mattress was bound in soft leather, its pages filled with the careful handwriting of a young woman documenting horrors that no 16-year-old should ever witness. Cole read the entries by lamplight in his office, each page revealing another layer of systematic abuse that had been hidden behind the Lanton family's facade of respectability. "Sheriff," Tom said quietly, "I found it when I went back to search Elizabeth's room while the family was at the town council meeting. The lock was broken, like someone had tried to destroy it, but didn't have time to finish the job." The diary entries painted a picture of a frightened girl trapped in a household where terrible things happened with disturbing regularity. Elizabeth had documented names, dates, and descriptions of men who visited the ranch for what her father called business meetings. But the business involved children from poor families, brought to the ranch under various pretenses and subjected to acts that Elizabeth could barely bring herself to describe in writing. Cole's hands trembled slightly as he read Elizabeth's account of previous incidents. "Papa says I must never tell anyone about the visitors, but I can't stop thinking about what they do to the children. Last month it was the Martinez boy, and before that little Jenny Walsh. They always leave different than when they arrived, quieter, more frightened, like something inside them has been broken." The most recent entry was dated 3 days before. Clara Mae's sleepover. "Papa has invited the Sullivan girl to visit. I know I should warn her, but he watches me too closely now. I think he suspects I've been keeping records. If something happens to me, I hope someone finds this diary and understands what's been happening here." Tom cleared his throat. "Sheriff, there's something else. Walt Kramer received a response to your telegram from Territorial Marshal Crawford. He's on his way here, but he won't arrive for at least 4 days. He also sent a warning. Apparently, some of Samuel Lanton's political connections have been asking questions about federal investigations in Arizona Territory." Cole felt a chill run down his spine. If word of his investigation had already reached Lanton's allies in the territorial government, then Elizabeth might be in even greater danger than he'd realized. Powerful men with political connections could make problems disappear, including witnesses who pose threats to their interests. "What happened at the town council meeting?" Cole asked. "About what you'd expect," Tom replied grimly. "Samuel Lanton gave a speech about protecting the community's reputation and maintaining harmony between different social classes. Mayor Pierce expressed concerns about your judgment and suggested that the investigation might be politically motivated." Cole wasn't surprised, but he was disappointed. He'd hoped that at least some council members would prioritize children's safety over political considerations. "How did they vote?" 5-2 in favor of a formal review of your handling of the case. They're giving you 48 hours to either produce solid evidence or face suspension pending a territorial review. The ultimatum was clearly designed to force Cole into backing down, but it also revealed how desperate Samuel Lanton had become. If the Lanton family felt secure in their position, they wouldn't need to apply such obvious political pressure. "Tom," Cole said, "I want you to take Elizabeth's diary to Dr. Morrison. Have him compare the dates and descriptions with his medical records. If we can establish a clear pattern linking the Lanton visitors to suspicious injuries among local children, we'll have the evidence we need." "What about you, Sheriff?" "I'm going to contact the families who left town after their children were hurt. If they're willing to come forward, their testimony combined with Elizabeth's diary and Dr. Morrison's records might be enough to convince even territorial officials that we're dealing with something serious." Cole spent the next several hours composing carefully worded telegrams to Bill Hendricks in Denver, the Whitman family in Phoenix, and the Prescotts in Tucson. Each message was brief but urgent. Their testimony was needed to protect other children from suffering the same trauma their own kids had endured. The responses began arriving before dawn. Bill Hendricks' reply was terse but supportive. "Will testify. Suspected truth for months. Can be in Willow Creek in 5 days." The Whitmans were more cautious. "Sarah still has nightmares. Afraid of making situation worse. Need assurance of protection before traveling." But it was the Prescotts' response that provided the most shocking revelation. "Elizabeth Lanton contacted us 6 months ago asking for help. Said she had evidence of her father's crimes. We were too frightened to respond. Is she still alive?" Cole stared at the telegram, understanding that Elizabeth had been trying to expose her father's criminal activities for months. She hadn't been just a victim. She'd been gathering evidence and reaching out to other families for support. The diary wasn't just a record of trauma. It was a deliberate attempt to document crimes that she hoped someone would eventually investigate. Deputy Tom burst through the office door, his face flushed with excitement. "Sheriff, Dr. Morrison found something. The dates in Elizabeth's diary match exactly with his medical records for injured children. We can prove that every time certain men visited the Lanton Ranch, a child in this community ended up with suspicious injuries." Cole felt a surge of hope, but it was tempered by growing concern for Elizabeth's safety. If she had been actively working to expose her father's crimes, then Samuel Lanton would consider her a direct threat to his freedom and political future. "Tom, I want you to organize a search party. We're going back to the Lanton Ranch, and this time we're going to find Elizabeth." "What about the town council's ultimatum?" "The town council can go to hell," Cole replied. "I've got evidence of systematic child abuse, witness testimony, and medical records that prove Samuel Lanton has been running a criminal enterprise for years. If they want to suspend me for investigating crimes against children, they'll have to explain that decision to Territorial Marshal Crawford." As the sun rose over Willow Creek, Cole strapped on his gun belt and checked his Winchester rifle one final time. Elizabeth's diary had provided the evidence he needed to justify aggressive action, but more importantly, it had revealed that somewhere out there was a brave young woman who had risked everything to protect other children from the monsters in her own family. The locked diary represented more than evidence. It was proof that even in the darkest situations, courage could emerge from unexpected places. Elizabeth Lanton had documented horrors that most people couldn't bear to imagine, but she'd done it with the hope that someone would eventually find her records and use them to seek justice. Cole understood that the next few hours would determine whether Elizabeth's courage would be rewarded with rescue or remembered as a tragic testament to the price of fighting powerful predators. But either way, her diary would ensure that the truth about Samuel Lanton's crimes could no longer remain hidden behind wealth and political connections. The hidden letter Tom discovered tucked inside Elizabeth's diary changed everything Cole thought he understood about the scope of Samuel Lanton's criminal enterprise. Written in careful script on territorial government letterhead, it revealed a network of corruption that reached far beyond Willow Creek into the highest levels of Arizona's political establishment. "Sheriff," Tom said, his voice tight with barely controlled rage, "this isn't just about the Lanton family. According to this correspondence, there are territorial officials who have been actively protecting similar operations in at least 6 other communities." Cole studied the letter with growing horror. Signed by Territorial Administrator Harrison Webb, a man Cole had met twice and considered honorable, the document outlined a systematic cover-up of child abuse cases across southern Arizona. Webb's letter to Samuel Lanton was businesslike in its callousness. "Recent inquiries from federal authorities require increased discretion. Recommend temporarily suspending operations until political climate improves." The letter was dated just 2 weeks earlier, which meant that Elizabeth's disappearance might not have been the result of a crime interrupted by Clara Mae's presence. Instead, it suggested that Samuel Lanton had been ordered to eliminate evidence of his activities, including his own daughter, who had been documenting those activities for months. "Tom, look at this section," Cole said, pointing to a paragraph that made his blood run cold. "Webb mentions that they've placed reliable personnel in key law enforcement positions throughout the territory to ensure that investigations can be controlled or redirected as needed." The implication was staggering. If territorial officials had been deliberately placing corrupt sheriffs and marshals in positions where they could protect criminal enterprises, like the Lanton operation, then Cole's message to Territorial Marshal Crawford might have been intercepted by the very people he was hoping to expose. Deputy Tom slumped into his chair, the weight of the revelation clearly overwhelming him. "Sheriff, what if Marshal Crawford isn't coming to help us? What if he's coming to silence us?" Cole had been wondering the same thing. Crawford's response to his telegram had seemed supportive, but it would be easy enough for a corrupt official to feign cooperation while actually working to eliminate threats to the network. The fact that Crawford was taking several days to reach Willow Creek could be interpreted as giving the conspirators time to clean up loose ends. "There's something else," Tom said, pulling another document from Elizabeth's diary. "This appears to be a list of names, children who've been taken to various ranches throughout the territory over the past 3 years. Sheriff, there are dozens of names on this list." Cole studied the carefully maintained records, recognizing some of the names from Dr. Morrison's medical journal, but seeing many more that were completely unfamiliar. Elizabeth had been conducting her own investigation across multiple communities, somehow gathering information about a territorial network of child predators that operated with official protection. The scope of what they were confronting suddenly became clear. This wasn't a local crime that could be solved by arresting Samuel Lanton and his associates. They were facing an organized criminal enterprise with political protection at the territorial level, and Cole's investigation had made him and everyone associated with it targets for elimination. "Sheriff," Tom said quietly, "I think we need to consider the possibility that we're in immediate danger. If these people have been eliminating evidence, then Clara Mae becomes a liability that needs to be silenced." Cole felt his stomach clench, with fear, not for himself, but for the brave child who had trusted him to protect her. If territorial officials were involved in covering up these crimes, then conventional law enforcement channels would be useless. Worse, they might actually work against him. The sound of approaching horses interrupted his thoughts. Through the window, Cole could see a group of riders approaching his office, men he didn't recognize wearing the badges of territorial deputy marshals. But something about their formation and the way they approached suggested this wasn't a friendly visit. "Tom, go out the back door and get to the Sullivan house immediately," Cole ordered. "Tell Patrick to take his family and get out of town right now. They need to disappear until we can figure out who can be trusted." What about you? I'm going to face these men and find out exactly what they want, Cole replied, checking his revolver and positioning himself behind his desk, where he could reach his Winchester rifle quickly. The lead rider dismounted and approached the office, Udor with the confident stride of someone accustomed to having his authority respected without question. When he entered, Cole immediately recognized the type. A career lawman whose moral compass had been corrupted by years of choosing political expedience over justice. "Sheriff Harding," the man said, flashing his territorial marshal credentials. "I'm Deputy Marshal Gordon Hayes. I'm here to discuss your recent communications with Territorial Marshal Crawford." Cole kept his voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through his system. "What about them?" "Marshal Crawford is concerned that you may have been given some inaccurate information about the Lanton family," Hayes replied. "There are political considerations involved in this situation that you may not fully understand." The euphemisms were clearly designed to provide plausible deniability, but Cole understood the real message. Hayes was here to make the investigation disappear, one way or another. "Deputy Marshal Hayes," Cole said carefully, "I have physical evidence of systematic child abuse, witness testimony, and medical records that document a pattern of crimes spanning several years. Those aren't political considerations, they're criminal acts that require prosecution." Hayes' expression hardened. "Sheriff, I think there may be some misunderstanding about the nature of your authority in this matter. Territorial crimes fall under territorial jurisdiction, and Marshal Crawford has decided that this investigation should be transferred to more experienced personnel." Cole felt the trap closing around him. If he surrendered his evidence to Hayes, it would disappear forever, and the children who had suffered would never see justice. But if he refused, he would be branded as insubordinate and possibly arrested for interfering with a territorial investigation. "Deputy Marshal Hayes," Cole said, "I'd be happy to cooperate with a legitimate territorial investigation, but first, I'd like to see written orders from Marshal Crawford authorizing the transfer of this case." The silence that followed stretched between them like a taut rope. Hayes's hand moved imperceptibly toward his sidearm, and Cole understood that the conversation was about to take a very different turn. The hidden letter in Elizabeth's diary had revealed that the corruption reached far beyond what Cole had imagined, but it had also provided him with names, dates, and documentary evidence of a conspiracy that included some of Arizona Territory's most powerful officials. The question now was whether he would live long enough to use that evidence to protect the children who depended on his courage. Cole's Winchester rifle had seen him through countless confrontations over 23 years of law enforcement, but as he positioned it within easy reach behind his desk, he understood that the weapon represented more than personal protection. It symbolized his final decision to fight a corrupt system that sacrificed children's safety for political convenience. Deputy Marshal Hayes studied Cole's face with the calculating expression of a man assessing potential resistance. The other territorial deputies remained mounted outside, their positions suggesting they were prepared for violence if Hayes's diplomatic approach failed to achieve the desired results. "Sheriff Harding," Hayes said, his tone becoming more overtly threatening, "I think you may be making this situation more complicated than it needs to be. Marshal Crawford simply wants to ensure that this investigation is handled with appropriate sensitivity to all parties involved." Cole understood the euphemisms. All parties meant Samuel Lanton and his political allies, while appropriate sensitivity meant burying evidence of systematic child abuse to protect territorial officials. Who had enabled those crimes? "Deputy Marshal Hayes," Cole replied evenly. "My only concern is ensuring that the children of this community are protected from predators. If Marshal Crawford shares that concern, then we should have no difficulty working together." Adabiso. Door opened before Hayes could respond, and Dr. Morrison entered carrying a leather medical bag and wearing the determined expression of a man who had decided that silence was no longer an option. "Sheriff," Dr. Morrison said, "I've finished comparing Elizabeth Lanton's diary entries with my medical records. The correlation is perfect. Every child whose injuries I documented suffered those injuries within days of visits to the Lanton Ranch by the men Elizabeth described in her diary." Hayes turned toward the doctor with barely concealed hostility. "Dr. Morrison, this is an official territorial investigation. Your medical records will need to be turned over to proper authorities." "I am turning them over to proper authorities," Dr. Morrison replied calmly. "Sheriff Harding has been investigating these crimes for days, while territorial officials have been conspicuously absent." Cole felt a surge of gratitude for the physician's courage, but he also recognized that Dr. Morrison had just made himself a target for the same forces that were trying to silence the investigation. The corruption revealed in Elizabeth's hidden letter meant that anyone who possessed evidence of territorial officials' complicity would be considered a threat to be eliminated. The sound of more approaching horses drew everyone's attention to the window. Cole's heart sank as he recognized Mayor Pierce riding with several town council members, their faces set in the grim expressions of men who had made a difficult decision and intended to follow through with it. "Sheriff Harding," Mayor Pierce called out as he dismounted, "the town council has reached a unanimous decision regarding your handling of this investigation. We're here to inform you that your services as sheriff are no longer required." Cole had expected this moment since his confrontation with Samuel Lanton, but the timing suggested coordination between the corrupt territorial officials and local politicians who prioritize their own interests over children's safety. "Mayor Pierce," Cole said, stepping out of his office to face the assembled officials, "are you telling me that the town council has decided to fire me for investigating child abuse?" "We're telling you that your employment has been terminated for exceeding your authority and creating unnecessary conflict with respected members of our community," Pierce replied, though his voice lacked conviction. Dr. Morrison stepped forward, his weathered face flushed with anger. "Jonathan Pierce, I've known you for 15 years, and I never thought I'd see the day when you'd sacrifice children's safety to protect your own political position." The mayor's face reddened, but before he could respond, Tom Brennan came running. Around the corner of the building, his young face tight with urgent news. "Sheriff," Tom called out, "Patrick Sullivan says Clara Mae is missing. She disappeared from their house sometime during the night, and there are signs of a struggle in her bedroom." The announcement hit Cole like a physical blow. Clara Mae's disappearance meant that the forces aligned against his investigation had moved beyond political pressure to direct action against witnesses. If Samuel Lanton's allies were willing to kidnap a child to prevent her testimony, then Elizabeth Lanton was almost certainly dead, and Clara Mae would suffer the same fate unless Cole could find her quickly. Deputy Marshal Hayes stepped forward with an expression of manufactured concern. This unfortunate development clearly demonstrates why territorial authorities should handle such complex investigations. Local law enforcement obviously lacks the resources to protect witnesses properly. Cole felt rage building in his chest, but he forced himself to remain calm. Hayes was trying to use Clara Mae's kidnapping to justify taking control of the investigation, which would ensure that both children disappeared forever. "Deputy Marshal Hayes," Cole said quietly, "if you want to help find Clara Mae, then let's work together. But if you're here to cover up crimes against children, then you and I are going to have problems." The tension in the street was palpable as the various factions faced each other in the morning sunlight. Cole understood that the next few minutes would determine not just his own fate, but the fate of Clara Mae, Elizabeth Lanton, and potentially dozens of other children who had suffered at the hands of predators protected by corrupt officials. Tom moved to stand beside Cole, his hand resting on his gun butt in a gesture of loyalty that could end his career or his life. Dr. Morrison remained near the office door, his medical bag in one hand and Elizabeth's diary in the other, evidence that powerful men were willing to kill to suppress. The Winchester rifle in Cole's office represented 23 years of faithful service to the cause of justice. But it also represented his willingness to fight against overwhelming odds when innocent lives hung in the balance. As he looked at the faces of the men arrayed against him, corrupt territorial officials, intimidated local politicians, and community leaders who had chosen expediency over courage, Cole understood that this moment would define not just his own legacy, but the future safety of every child in Willow Creek. The sun climbed higher in the Arizona sky, casting sharp shadows across the dusty street where the final confrontation was about to unfold. Cole's weathered hand moved slowly toward his gun belt, not in preparation for violence, but in silent acknowledgement that some battles could only be won by men willing to risk everything for principles that transcended political convenience and personal safety. The court summons that arrived with the dawn mail changed everything. Instead of coming from corrupt territorial officials, the official documents bore the seal of the U.S. District Court and the signature of Federal Marshal James Crawford. Not the territorial Marshal Cole had contacted, but his federal counterpart, who had been conducting his own investigation into child trafficking across the Southwest. "Sheriff Harding," Federal Marshal Crawford announced as he strode down Main Street with 6 federal deputies, "I apologize for the deception in my earlier communications, but we needed to maintain operational security while building our case against territorial officials." Cole felt a mixture of relief and vindication as he realized that help had arrived from an unexpected source. The real James Crawford was a weathered man in his 50s, with steel-gray eyes that held the steady resolve of someone who had spent decades fighting corruption at the highest levels. Deputy Marshal Hayes stepped forward, his territorial credentials suddenly seeming inadequate in the presence of federal authority. "Marshal Crawford, I believe there's been some confusion here. This is a territorial matter that's being handled through proper channels." "Deputy Marshal Hayes," Crawford replied coldly, "you're under arrest for conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and complicity in crimes against children. Your proper channels include officials who have been taking money to protect child traffickers." The federal deputies moved with practiced efficiency, disarming Hayes and his men before they could react. Cole watched with satisfaction as the corrupt lawmen were led away in shackles, their threats and bluster replaced by the silence of men who understood that their careers and freedom were over. Mayor Pierce stepped forward with the nervous energy of a man trying to distance himself from a sinking ship. "Marshal Crawford, I want to assure you that the town council has been fully supportive of Sheriff Harding's investigation. Any earlier disagreements were simply matters of procedure." Crawford fixed the mayor with a contemptuous stare. "Mr. Pierce, we have documented evidence of your attempts to interfere with a federal investigation. Whether you face charges will depend on your cooperation in locating the missing children." Tom approached Cole with excitement barely contained in his voice. "Sheriff Clara Mae's alive. Marshal Crawford's men found her locked in a basement at the Lanton Ranch, along with Elizabeth and 2 other children from neighboring communities." Cole felt tears of relief spring to his eyes. "Are they safe? Are they hurt?" "They're frightened and traumatized, but alive," Crawford replied. "Dr. Morrison is examining them now, and we'll need their testimony to complete our case against the entire network." The federal marshal pulled out a thick folder filled with documents, photographs, and correspondence that represented months of careful investigation. "Sheriff Harding, your telegram alerted us to activities we'd been tracking across multiple territories. The Lanton Ranch was just one node in a network that included territorial officials, wealthy ranchers, and businessmen who believed their money and connections made them untouchable." Cole studied the evidence with growing amazement. The federal investigation had uncovered a conspiracy that reached into territorial governments across the Southwest, with Samuel Lanton serving as a regional coordinator for activities that generated substantial profits for everyone involved. "How long have you been watching them?" Cole asked. Nearly 2 years, Crawford replied. We needed to identify all the participants and gather sufficient evidence to ensure convictions at the federal level. Your investigation forced us to move earlier than planned, but Clara Mae's courage in coming forward provided the final pieces we needed. Dr. Morrison emerged from his examination of the rescued children with a grim expression that gradually softened into something approaching hope. Marshal Crawford, all 4 children show signs of trauma and abuse, but they're remarkably resilient. With proper care and support, they should recover fully. Clara Mae appeared in the doorway of Dr. Morrison's office, pale and shaken, but alive. When she saw Cole, she ran to him with the desperate relief of a child who had never expected to see safety again. "Sheriff Harding," she whispered, "Elizabeth saved us. When the bad men came to take us away, she fought them and told us where to hide. She said you would find us because you promised to protect children." Cole knelt down and held the trembling girl, understanding that her courage had not only exposed Samuel Lanton's crimes, but had helped federal authorities dismantle an entire network of predators who had operated with impunity for years. Elizabeth Lanton emerged from the doctor's office, no longer the frightened girl who had documented horrors in her secret diary, but a young woman who had found the strength to protect other children, even at great personal risk. Her face bore the marks of recent violence, but her eyes held a determination that reminded Cole of the finest lawman he'd known. "Sheriff," Elizabeth said, "I want to testify against my father and everyone who helped him. I want to make sure this never happens to other children." Crawford nodded with respect for the girl's courage. "Miss Lanton, your testimony and documentation will be crucial to securing convictions against every person involved in this conspiracy. You've shown remarkable bravery in the face of unimaginable circumstances." As federal deputies led Samuel Lanton away in chains, the man who had once wielded enormous power over Willow Creek looked like what he truly was: a broken criminal whose wealth and connections could no longer protect him from the consequences of his actions. The court summons that had arrived that morning represented more than legal documentation. It symbolized the moment when hidden crimes were finally brought into the light of justice, and when the courage of children like Clara Mae and Elizabeth proved stronger than the corruption of powerful adults who had betrayed their trust. The territorial warrant that Federal Marshal Crawford presented to the assembled crowd represented the complete vindication of Cole's investigation and the beginning of justice for children who had suffered in silence for years. The official document, bearing the seal of the U.S. District Court, authorized the arrest of 17 territorial officials, including Territorial Administrator Harrison Webb and 6 county sheriffs who had been protecting criminal enterprises across Arizona territory. "Sheriff Harding," Crawford said, his voice carrying across the gathered townspeople, "your investigation has exposed a conspiracy that reaches into the highest levels of territorial government. Without your courage in pursuing this case, despite political pressure, dozens of children would have continued to suffer while their abusers operated with official protection." Cole felt the weight of vindication, but also the profound sadness of understanding how many children had been hurt, while adults who should have protected them chose instead to look the other way. The territorial warrant in Crawford's hands represented justice delayed, but not justice denied. Tom stepped forward with news that brought the investigation to its conclusion. "Marshal Crawford, we've located the records Samuel Lanton kept of his business associates across the territory. The documentation includes names, dates, financial transactions, and detailed accounts of criminal activities spanning 5 years. Crawford nodded grimly. "That evidence will ensure that everyone involved in this network faces federal charges that can't be influenced by local politics or territorial corruption. We're talking about sentences that will keep these men in federal prison for the rest of their lives." Elizabeth Lanton approached Cole with a mixture of relief and determination in her young face. Despite everything she'd endured, she had found the strength to stand up to the most powerful people in her world and demand justice for other children who had suffered as she had. "Sheriff Harding," Elizabeth said, "I want you to know that documenting what happened wasn't just about gathering evidence. It was about making sure that if something happened to me, someone would eventually understand the truth and protect other children." Cole felt profound respect for the girl's courage. "Elizabeth, your diary and your willingness to testify will save other children from going through what you experienced. That takes a kind of bravery that most adults never find." Dr. Morrison approached with the final medical reports that would complete the federal case against the network. "Marshal Crawford, I've documented evidence of systematic abuse involving at least 23 children over the past 4 years. The physical evidence corroborates every account these brave young people have given us." The physician's voice carried the weight of a man who had finally found the courage to speak truths he'd suspected for years. "I should have acted sooner, but I was afraid of powerful people and worried about my own position in the community. These children showed more courage than I did." Crawford placed a hand on Dr. Morrison's shoulder. "Doctor, your medical evidence will be crucial to securing convictions. What matters now is that you found the courage to do the right thing when it mattered most." Clara Mae emerged from her parents' embrace and walked to where Cole stood with the federal marshal. Despite her ordeal, the 8-year-old girl had regained some of the sparkle in her green eyes, though Cole understood that healing would take time and patience. "Sheriff Harding," Clara Mae said, "my papa says you risked everything to save me and Elizabeth. Why did you do that when important people told you to stop?" Cole knelt down to meet her eyes, understanding that his answer would shape how this brave child viewed justice and courage for the rest of her life. "Clara Mae, some things are more important than being safe or popular. Protecting children from people who want to hurt them is the most important job any adult can have." The territorial warrant in Crawford's hands represented far more than legal documentation. It validated every decision Cole had made, despite overwhelming pressure from corrupt officials and intimidated community leaders. The systematic dismantling of the network had already begun, with arrests taking place simultaneously across 6 territories. "Sheriff," Crawford said, "the Department of Justice will be recommending you for federal recognition for your handling of this investigation. Your willingness to pursue justice despite political pressure exemplifies the highest traditions of law enforcement." Cole felt gratitude for the recognition, but more importantly, he felt satisfaction that the children of Willow Creek would never again face the threat that had terrorized them for years. The badge on his chest had never meant more than it did at this moment. Mayor Pierce approached with the subdued manner of a man who understood how close he had come to disaster. "Sheriff Harding, on behalf of the town council, I want to apologize for our lack of support during your investigation. We were wrong to prioritize political considerations over children's safety." "Mayor Pierce," Cole replied, "what matters now is that this community learns from what happened here. Children's safety must always come first, regardless of who might be inconvenienced by investigations or prosecutions." Tom looked at the scene with the amazement of a young man witnessing the triumph of justice over corruption. "Sheriff, I've learned more about real law enforcement in the past week than I thought I'd learn in years. Thank you for showing me what it means to put duty before personal safety." Cole felt pride in his deputy's growth, understanding that Tom would carry forward the lessons of this investigation throughout his own career in law enforcement. "Tom, remember that the badge doesn't make you brave. Courage comes from your willingness to protect people who can't protect themselves." As evening approached over Willow Creek, Cole reflected on the events that had transformed his quiet frontier town into the center of a federal investigation that would be remembered for years. The territorial warrant had brought justice, but it had also revealed how many adults had failed to protect the children in their care. The network of corruption had been dismantled, But Cole understood that similar threats could emerge anywhere that powerful people believed their wealth and influence placed them above the law. The price of protecting innocence would always be eternal vigilance and the courage to confront evil regardless of its social position or political connections. Elizabeth Lanton's diary had documented horrors that most people couldn't imagine, but it had also preserved evidence that ensured her father and his associates would face justice. Clara Mae's courage in reporting what she'd witnessed had broken open a conspiracy that might have continued for years if she hadn't found the strength to speak truth to power. The territorial warrant represented the moment when the rule of law finally prevailed over the rule of wealth and influence, proving that in America, even the most powerful criminals could be brought to justice when brave people refused to remain silent in the face of evil. 6 months had passed since the federal arrests that dismantled the child trafficking network, and Willow Creek had begun the slow process of healing from revelations that had shaken the community to its foundations. The new sheriff's badge that Tom Brennan now wore represented not just a promotion, but a commitment to the principles Cole had taught him about protecting the innocent, regardless of personal cost or political pressure. Cole stood in the doorway of the sheriff's office, watching his former deputy handle the routine business of law enforcement with the confidence and integrity that would serve the community well for years to come. At 58, Cole had decided that his work in Willow Creek was complete, and he was preparing to accept a position with the Federal Marshal Service investigating similar cases across the Southwest. "Sheriff Brennan," Clara Mae called out as she skipped down Main Street, her auburn curls catching the morning sunlight and her green eyes sparkling with the resilience that had helped her survive trauma that would have broken many adults. At 9 years old, she had become something of a local hero, though she seemed unaware of her special status in the community. Tom smiled and knelt down to meet her eyes, just as Cole had taught him to do when talking with children. "Good morning. Clara Mae, how are you feeling today?" "Much better," she replied with the matter-of-fact tone children use when discussing serious subjects. "Mama says the nightmares are getting less frequent, and Dr. Morrison says my mind is healing, just like a broken bone heals if you give it time and proper care." Cole felt profound satisfaction knowing that Clara Mae was recovering from her ordeal with the support of a community that had finally learned to prioritize children's welfare over adult convenience. The trauma would always be part of her story, but it would not define the rest of her life. Elizabeth Lanton appeared at the end of the street, walking with the purposeful stride of a young woman who had found direction and meaning in her experiences. At 17, she had completed her testimony in the federal trials that had sent her father and 16 other men to federal prison for life. Now she was preparing to attend the territorial normal school, where she planned to become a teacher, specializing in helping children who had suffered trauma. "Good morning, Sheriff Brennan," Elizabeth said, her voice carrying the quiet strength that had helped her survive years of horror while documenting evidence that would protect other children. "I wanted to thank you and Sheriff Harding again. Before I leave for school next week." Tom stood and shook Elizabeth's hand with the respect due to someone whose courage had changed lives across the territory. "Miss Lanton, you don't need to thank us. You're the one who preserved the evidence that made justice possible." Cole stepped forward, understanding that this might be his last conversation with the brave young woman whose diary had exposed a network of corruption that reached the highest levels of territorial government. "Elizabeth, your decision to document what you witnessed and your willingness to testify took more courage than most people show in a lifetime. You should be proud of what you've accomplished." Elizabeth's eyes brightened with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had found purpose in suffering. "Sheriff Harding, I've decided to dedicate my life to protecting children who find themselves in situations like mine. If my experiences can help other young people find their voices and seek help, then everything I went through will have served a purpose." Dr. Morrison emerged from his office carrying the medical bag that had become a symbol of his renewed commitment to speaking out when children's safety was at stake. Over the past 6 months, he had testified in federal court, published papers on recognizing signs of child abuse, and established protocols that would help physicians across the territory identify and report suspicious injuries. "Gentlemen, Miss Lanton," Dr. Morrison said with the satisfaction of a man who had found redemption in doing the right thing despite personal risk, "I wanted to let you know that I've received inquiries from physicians in 12 other territories who want training in recognizing and documenting evidence of child abuse. It seems our experience here in Willow Creek has started something much larger." Cole nodded with deep satisfaction. The investigation that had begun with one frightened child's courage had grown into a movement that would protect vulnerable children across the American frontier. The new sheriff's badge Tom wore represented not just local law enforcement, but participation in a network of officials committed to placing children's safety above political expediency. Patrick Sullivan approached the group with the measured gait of a man who had watched his daughter survive trauma that could have destroyed her spirit. The blacksmith's strong hands bore the calluses of honest labor, but his eyes held the gratitude of a father whose child had been saved by the courage of good people. "Sheriff Harding," Patrick said, "Mary and I want you to know that Clara Mae talks about you every day. She says you taught her that speaking the truth is always the right thing to do, even when it's frightening." Cole felt tears spring to his eyes as he thought about the 8-year-old girl whose desperate plea for help had changed the course of so many lives. "Patrick, Clara Mae taught me something too. She showed me that real courage often comes from the most unexpected places, and that children sometimes understand justice better than the adults who are supposed to protect them." Walt Kramer emerged from the general store carrying a telegram that would represent the final chapter of the Willow Creek investigation. "Sheriff Harding, this just came in from Washington. The Department of Justice says the last of the territorial officials involved in the network has been convicted and sentenced. The case is officially closed." The telegram represented more than the conclusion of legal proceedings. It symbolized the victory of justice over corruption, of courage over convenience, and of children's safety over adult self-interest. Cole understood that the work would continue in other communities and other territories, but Willow Creek would always represent the place where ordinary people found extraordinary courage when innocent lives hung in the balance. As the sun reached its zenith over the small frontier town, Cole looked at the faces of the people who had chosen to do the right thing despite personal risk. Tom had sacrificed career security to stand with justice. Dr. Morrison had overcome years of professional caution to document evidence of abuse. Elizabeth had risked everything to preserve records of her father's crimes, and Clara Mae had found the courage to speak truth to power when powerful adults preferred silence. The new sheriff's badge represented hope for the future, a future in which children like Clara Mae and Elizabeth would never again face the horrors that had been hidden. Behind wealth and political influence, Cole's own badge had served its purpose, but the principles it represented would live on in the next generation of lawmen who understood that protecting the innocent was not just a job, but a sacred trust that transcended personal ambition or political pressure. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen across Main Street, Cole reflected on the simple truth that had guided his investigation from the beginning. Sometimes it takes the courage of one good person to protect an entire community from evil, and sometimes that courage emerges from the most unexpected places, like the heart of a frightened child whose torn blue dress told a story that powerful men had hoped would never be heard.